Hello, welcome to the Craft House Magic Set of tutorials. Today is part 2 of the top down sock tutorial where I'm going to show you how to do the heel flap gusset and decreases down to the foot of the sock. So in part 1 I showed you how to cast on, do the ribbed section and knit down to the heel flap area. So I've now knitted between 5 and 6 inches from the cast on edge, and that's the length of sock that I like, but you can knit it as long or as short as you want to for you. So in the first tutorial I showed you that when you were at the rib section you could disperse the stitches so that they were slightly uneven. So I've got 32 stitches on my front needle and 28 stitches on my back needle. So I need to transfer 2 stitches from this needle onto this needle to make them equal, because I'm doing a 60 stitch sock. And you must remember to make sure that you equalise your stitches at this point, otherwise your heel flap might not be big enough. So I've transferred the stitches so that I've now got 30 stitches on each needle, and the reason why we did have them uneven is because it's easier to do the ribbed section when you start off with a knit on each side of the work. But now we want half the stitches on both sides. So I am now going to work across this side so that I'm facing, the inside of the work is facing me. We're going to do a setup row. And I'm going to do a contrast heel, so I'm going to be changing my yarn here. But if you just want to carry on in your normal yarn, obviously don't cut the yarn like I have here, and just carry on with the yarn you are knitting the rest of the sock with. You'll have less ends to sew in. So I'm going to engage my back needle ready to work and take the end of my yarn. If I can find the end of it. There we go. You can see that I've got my progress keeper. I've moved it up the work so that I know where the start of my round is as I was working down the sock. So I have got some instructions written out for the top down sock that you can find on Ravelry. I'll pop a link down below so you can get to those. In the pattern it says to slip the first stitch. But if you are changing your yarn to a contrast yarn, I'd advise you actually to purl this stitch instead of slipping it, because you'll end up with a slipped stitch of this yarn going into the heel flap and it'll look a little bit odd. So I'm hooking on the end of the yarn to start my new colour, and then I'm just going to tension the ends that I've attached or got hanging from the previous part of the knitting, and I'm going to purl right across the work here. So I've now purled across the back of the heel flap. I'm going to turn my work over and I'm going to carry on working on those stitches that I've knitted in the contrast yarn, and I'm going to be doing a 2-row repeat where I'll be doing some slip stitches. Now slip stitches are ideal because it strengthens your heel flap. If you're going to be wearing these socks a lot, it'll make them last longer. So this first row of the 2-row repeat, I'm going to carry on with the contrast yarn for my heels and toes. I'm going to slip the first stitch knitwise, which means I put my needle in the yarn as if to knit and then just pull it onto your working needle. And then I'm going to knit the second stitch, and then I'm going to slip the next stitch purlwise, which means I'm not twisting that yarn at all. You do not want to twist these stitches at all in the middle of the heel flap, so you definitely want to slip those purlwise, whereas on the edge, if you slip them knitwise, that will twist them slightly and give you a nice edge to your heel flap. So I'm going to go knit 1, slip 1, all the way across, not forgetting that I want to do a purlwise slip all across the heel flap. It's only on the edge stitch that's slipped knitwise. You should end up with a knit stitch on the end of your heel flap, and I'm just retensioning the ends of my yarn here just to keep it nice and neat. So that's row 1 of the heel flap repeat, and then you've got row 2, which again you're working back on yourself. You're taking the working yarn, slipping the first stitch, and now you're just slipping this purlwise as it's a purl stitch, and then you're going to purl right across that row, being careful not to purl that slip stitch and the knitted stitch together as you're working across. And there we are, we've purled across the back side, and we turn it to the front of the work again, and we are going to repeat the same row 1 of the heel flap as we did just now. So I'm going to slip the first stitch knitwise, then knit 1, slip 1 purlwise, knit 1, slip 1 purlwise, and I'm going to repeat the knit 1, slip 1 purlwise all the way across the heel flap. So that's row 1 complete again. I'm going to turn it round and do row 2. I'm going to slip purlwise the first stitch and then purl all the way across the work. So there we are. I'm going to keep repeating those 2 rows. You can just about see those little lines of slip stitches appearing across the heel flap, and it's easy to know which stitches you should be slipping because you can see the row below where it's been slipped. So I'm going to do a few more rows now, and then I'll come back to you and show you what it looks like. So you can now see I've done 16 repeats of those 2 rows, and you have these columns of slip stitches down the back of the work, which is a nice design feature but also gives it strength. So I'm now going to do the gusset section. So because I'm doing a 60 stitch sock and I have 30 stitches on the back of the work, I'm going to knit across 17 stitches. But if you look at my pattern, you can find the different stitch counts that you'll need to knit across for the different sizes. So I've now knitted 17 stitches across the work, and I'm going to slip, slip, put them back onto that needle but leave the right hand needle in through the back of the loops and knit. So that's an SSK. Oops. There we go. And then I'm going to knit 1 stitch. And then I just tend to check that I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 stitches left for this particular size, and I just make sure that I've got an equal number of stitches on this side when I finish the centre part. So I'm then going to turn the work, slip the first stitch and purl 5 stitches. And then I'm going to purl 2 together and purl 1, and then I should have the same number of stitches this side, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So as long as I've got an equal number of stitches either side, I know that my gusset will be in the centre. Turn the work again. I'm now going to slip the first stitch and then knit to where the gap in the work is, but one stitch off. So there's a clear gap in the work there, and I've just stopped one stitch away from that, and then I'm going to do an SSK, so slip knitwise, and then knit through the back there, and then knit one more, and I'm going to turn around, slip the first stitch purlwise and purl to one stitch away from that gap. And I find that rather than counting your stitches, you can just knit up to the gap in the work. So there we are, there's the gap, and I'm going to purl these two stitches together and purl the next one and turn the work around. Slip stitch, knit across to the gap in the work, so I'm repeating what I've just done, but obviously knitting slightly further each time. Knit to one stitch from the gap in the work, slip, slip, knit two together, knit one, and then we're going to turn around again, slip purlwise, purl to the gap in the work, one stitch away from the gap, purl those two together, purl one, turn your work around, slip the first stitch, knit across to one stitch away from the gap again, so you're basically repeating the same two rows on the knit side and the purl side, so you're knitting to one stitch away from the gap, slip, slip, knit through the back of the work, oops, knit one, and you've got this nice edge there. Turn around, and I shall carry on with this, and I'll speed up the film so you can see how it works up. So I'm almost finished. I've just literally used up all the stitches on the right side. I'm going to turn to do the last row of the heel flap. I'm going to slip the first stitch and purl to the gap. Purl two together and purl the last stitch. Now on this stitch count I'm using up all the stitches with doing the last knit, but on some stitch count you'll see in the pattern that you may just be doing the purl two together or knit two together on the last two rows, but that's fine. So I'm going to start knitting with the new yarn, or the yarn that I've been using for the main body of the sock, and I'm just going to knit across the heel flap there. So I've now finished knitting stitches across the heel flap, and we're going to pick stitches all the way up the side. So you can see on the side of the work there are these slip stitches that you did on the beginning of the row, and you need to pop your needle in there underneath the two legs of the slip stitch on the very edge and pull a stitch through, making sure not to be too tight with your yarn. So I'm going on to the second one, and you're basically picking up a stitch for every 2 rows of the heel flap. You'll find that on the edge here where your ends are just hanging, it'll be a little bit loose, but you can tighten that up as you're sewing your ends in. So you should be able to pick up the same amount of stitches as you've got rows, but don't worry if you do have a few more. As long as they're relatively equal on each side, that's fine. The main thing is that you don't want to leave a gap in this corner here. So what I like to do is pick up 1 or 2 stitches and make sure that when you pick them up there isn't a hole produced. So I think that one looks quite good, so I'm going to keep that. I'm going to pick up a stitch and show you what it would look like if it was going to form a hole. So if I just lifted the yarn here and picked up a stitch, that's going to form a big hole in the corner of your heel flap, so you don't want that. I think for this case that picking up this stitch is probably enough. I'll undo that stitch and just show you again. Quite often if you stick your needle into a stitch rather than just where there's a yarn running across, you'll end up with less holes. So there we go. So that's it. So now I've picked up along that side, I'm just going to knit across these stitches at the top. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to split my stitches so that I've got the bottom of the heel turn and the stitches from this side of the foot on that side, because I'm going to be working it in magic loop, and then I'll use the stitches from the top of the foot and for this side on this needle. So I will pull my needle from the back of the work to work on the front of the work there, and as normal when you're doing magic loop you need to make sure that you pull it relatively firmly at the edge so that you don't get a gaping hole. So I'm just going to knit right across basically the top of the foot here. So I finished knitting across the top of the foot, and I'm going to start picking some stitches up alongside the left hand of the heel flap here. Now again, you need to pop your needle into places where you think it won't make a hole in your work to pick up stitches. It's just a case of trial and error to see where you think the smallest hole will be, and then start picking stitches along the side of the work like you did on the other side of the heel flap. And as long as you've got roughly the same amount of stitches on both sides of the heel flap, you're okay. The more rows you'll have done on your heel flap, the more stitches you'll have had to pick up. So if you've done a couple of extra rows because you've got a high instep, you'll have to pick up a few more stitches, and this in turn will give you more room in your sock. So I will just carry on picking up these stitches along the side of the heel flap, and then when I get to the bottom I'll talk to you about how I start decreasing my stitches. So again, you can see on one needle I've got the stitches from the top of the foot and the one side of the heel flap, and on the other needle I've got the bottom of the heel turn and the side of the heel flap there. This seems a little bit awkward to start with, but once you've started decreasing the number of stitches you had, it's far more comfortable. So I'm going to carry on with my main colour in the round, and I'm going to pop. Sometimes what I tend to do is that I actually just tie these ends together just in a square knot and a bow, just to keep them tidy and a little bit out of the way, like so, and I'll tuck those inside just to keep those so that they're not sort of hanging out everywhere. So I'm going to engage the needle to knit on the bottom of the foot again on the heel flap, and I'm going to knit all the way around to a couple of stitches from the end of the needle. So I'm 2 stitches away from the end of this needle, and I'm going to knit those 2 stitches together because I'm going to start decreasing, and it actually compensates for those extra stitches that you've picked up in the corners there. It looks a little bit loose here, but just because my threads are still hanging from where I changed yarns before, so I'm going to tie those in a square knot and in a bow just to keep them out of the way for now. I will undo that when I'm going to be sewing in the ends, but it just keeps my tension nice. So I'm then going to knit, basically I need to knit 30 stitches because I'm doing a 60 stitch sock size, but it's whatever half of your stitch count is, and then you're going to place a stitch marker. So there we are. This is where I've started to pick up stitches down the heel flap. So I'm going to pop a stitch marker on there, and then I'm going to do an SSK. And you know that where the stitch marker is where you're going to be reducing your stitches down to the size that you want for your foot. And that's easy to find. So I've now finished one round of the decreases. I'm going to do a second round where I'm going to decrease exactly the same. So I'm now 2 stitches from the edge of the work, and I'm going to knit 2 together on this side. And I'm going to turn my work. And start knitting on this side, so you're working on the top of the foot now. You want to knit up to that stitch marker that you placed. So we're going to slip the stitch marker and then do an SSK on this edge. And then carry on knitting to the end of the row. So now you're going to do a plain knit all the way around for one round. Turn your work and knit all the way down the other side. So I'm going to slip the stitch marker and just knit to the end of that round. So you'll have noticed that we've sort of switched where the beginning of the round is just for now. So you could move your progress keeper if you wanted to this point here. So I think I'll do that for now, just so that I don't confuse you. So this point, this side here, is going to be the beginning of the round for now, and you can swap that later to the same point as this point when we finish doing the decreases. So we're going to do 2 rows repeated where you knit to 2 stitches before the end here and knit 2 together, turn it over, knit to the stitch marker, do an SSK and knit to the end. So that's row 1, and then row 2 is just knit all the way around. So you repeat those 2 rows until you have the right stitch count for your foot. Now it isn't always the same as the measurement of your leg. I know that I tend to actually need 60 stitches around the leg as well as the foot, but if you have a slimmer foot or a wider foot, you might want to decrease to a different stitch count. But here's your chance to make sure that you've got the right stitch number that'll actually fit your foot nicely. So I'm going to carry on doing these 2 rows repeated where I decrease 1 row and then do a plain row until I've got my stitch count of 60 stitches back again. But again, like I said, make sure that that stitch count is the stitch count that's going to fit your foot. So I've knitted those 2 rows, decreasing on every other row until I'm back to the stitch count that I wanted to fit my foot. So what I'm going to do now is knit round to where this stitch marker is here. So now I'm at the stitch marker, I'm going to remove the stitch marker and I'm going to transfer those stitches onto the back of the needle so that we've now got an equal stitch count on the front and the back. So I'm going to turn it around. So I want to carry on knitting in the round as we have done before, just on magic loop, until the foot measures 1.5 inches shorter than the full length of the foot you're trying to fit it to. What I like to do is then move the progress keeper back to the beginning of the round, and you can tell it's the beginning of the round because it's on the side where your yarn's hanging off, but it's easier to tell which side you're on because now the sock's quite long and you have to keep checking where the end is. So I keep knitting in the round like we did in this section here until the work measures 1.5 inches shorter than the foot length that you want to fit. What I like to do is to measure the foot length by folding it carefully over, making sure that the heel flap is in line with the other side, and then measure from here to here, well, this edge here. So that's got to be 1.5 inches shorter than your foot length. So if you carry on knitting until you're ready to do the toe, and then I shall be publishing a video how to do your toe decreases and then the Kitchener stitch. So if you're enjoying the tutorials, don't forget to give me the thumbs up and to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll be back with you in the next podcast or in part 3 of my top down sock. Thank you for watching. Bye!